Are you curious about what it's like to be in a hurricane right here in Florida, and maybe some of the preparation and things like that you need to do? That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into it. What is going on? It is Andrew with the Emerald Group right here at eXp Realty. Listen, if you guys are trying to figure out everything there is to know about the Emerald Coast, from Pensacola to Panama City and everything in between, you've come to the right channel. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me and tap that little bell so that you'll be notified every single time we do a new video. You want to know what? Actually, this would be a little bit more fitting if we move the camera. 1 second. All right, I think this gives you a much better picture as we have a beautiful rainstorm right behind us. This is not a hurricane, in case you were thinking, what is this crazy dude doing at work trying to shoot in the middle of a hurricane? That's not the case. We actually had a couple of tropical storms or potential hurricanes that were kind of working their way up a couple of weeks ago, but those are long gone. So this is what a normal rainstorm looks like in Florida. Now, before we get into the rest of the content real quick, if you guys like what you see, go ahead and hit that like button. And keep in mind, we're getting calls, texts, and emails all the time of people wanting to move right here to the Florida Panhandle. If that sounds like you, go ahead and give us a call, text, or email. All of my information is on the screen. We'd love to help. All right, let's get into this. So first and foremost, before a hurricane comes, whether you are living down here, maybe you're vacationing, maybe you're thinking about moving down here and you want to know exactly what it's like. Now, hurricanes are of course terrible. You can see some of the wreckage. You see it all the time in the news whenever a bad one hits, but that's really the rarity, not the norm. So just because a hurricane comes through does not necessarily mean it does a ton of damage. But we're not going to get into that right now. Let's start with what you need to do to prepare. So if you are living near a coastal town, or really any part in Florida is subject to get hit by a hurricane, I don't think there's any section of Florida that is hurricane proof. So keep that in mind, that if you are living in Florida, you should probably have a hurricane disaster kit or a go bag or whatever you want to call it. There are certain things that you can look into putting in here. I would make sure you Google them to make sure that I'm not missing anything, because there is a good possibility that I might miss something that you might want in there. But one of the main things is, of course, food and water. They generally suggest you want 3 days of each for every person in your household. So that means they suggest a gallon. I really think half a gallon is fine per day. So 1.5 gallons to 3 gallons per person. If you are living by yourself or just with a partner, then, it's not going to be that much. But if you are a full family, of course, that does start stacking up, especially when you start adding in the food, because that needs to be 3 days of non-perishable food items. At least that's what they suggest. Now, 99.999% of the time, you're never going to need any of this stuff, really. But it's really good to have just in case. If you do get something, or hurricane turns at the last second, or it jumps to a Category 5 at the last second, especially if you're on a barrier or a coastal town in general, you're generally going to get hit pretty good. So you want to make sure that you've got this stuff. So you want extra flashlights, you want batteries, first aid kit, your pet supplies. Don't forget your pets. A lot of people leave pets. You hear about that in the news all the time. I'm really hoping that doesn't happen as much as they make it sound, but if you do have a pet, it is your responsibility to keep them. Please do that. Don't abandon them. That's a very terrible thing to do, but keep your pet supplies, your baby supplies, anything that you need to keep the family running in case you have to get up out of the house to run to your neighbor's house or something like that. Keep in mind that on some of these really bad hurricanes, that does happen. In fact, it just happened to one of our agents during Hurricane Sally last year. It was pretty traumatic. Literally midway through the storm, they had to get out and run to a neighbor's house, and because there was just so much damage, a lot of water damage and things like that. So, all right, that's your hurricane preparedness kit. I'm sure I'm missing a ton of other stuff. You should probably keep other items in there, such as maybe a knife or a Leatherman that's got multiple tools in case something, you need something like that. But other than that, I think you're mostly covered. So for me personally, what I like to do is keep a go bag with a change of clothes, and then I will keep one of those 3-gallon containers that you can get, that you fill up at either Walmart or one of those fill-up stations. There's a ton of them out here. It's like a quarter a gallon or something like that. You throw it in here, it fills it up. I just keep 2 of those at my house in my garage. They stay there year round. I've always got non-perishable food items, enough for well over 3 days at any given time. And that's really most of what I do. I've already got lots of flashlights and batteries and the first aid kit, all your meds. That's another one that's very important. Make sure that's in there. And then a few days before the storm too, my suggestion is to go to the store, make sure you've got enough toilet paper and, just all the amenities that you need at the house in case you run out of power for a little while and you're stuck there for a couple of days. while you're waiting for it. And also another suggestion I've got for you is whenever you hear that there is a tropical storm brewing up in the Gulf or a hurricane brewing and it might be headed your way, go ahead and fill up your cars now, or any car that you might need. If you've got 2 or 3 vehicles, but you're only going to need to take one to evacuate in that event, then just fill up the one. This way you've got enough gas for everybody else. You'll notice that typically, at least in our area, and I think this is most parts of Florida, that whenever a hurricane is coming through or thought to be coming through, you know, if one of the spaghetti models are showing that it's going to come through, most of the gas stations are going to get packed up pretty quick. The prices will rise a little bit as, you know, there's a supply and demand flux there. So try to do it a little bit earlier if you can. There's nothing worse than having half a tank or quarter of a tank or less, and then realizing the hurricane just took a turn and you're in an evacuation zone and you need to get out of there. So that's never any good. You can generally start heading up north or whichever direction you're going and find gas, but keep in mind you're not the only person doing that, so along the route it's going to be a little bit more difficult, especially because whenever people are evacuating, they tend to go one of several different ways. So you've got a huge influx of people going those directions. So just keep that in mind, be prepared in case that happens. Now, a lot of us Floridians, I know if you're from Florida or any other place that gets hurricanes, you're probably listening to this going, that's not what we really do. What we really do is grab a whole bunch of beer and booze and board games, and we invite our friends over for what we call a hurricane party. Yes, that actually happens all the time. It's pretty common. You get kind of used to doing these hurricanes, especially the tropical storms and things like that, which, well, it's kind of clearing up now, but how it was earlier in the video, how it was coming down, that's kind of really all it feels like. It's basically rain. A little bit of wind, the rain might be going a little bit sideways, but really, I mean, that's it. That's what a tropical storm looks like. So when you guys are hearing that, you know, tropical storm, or I forgot the other term, there's another one that's, I think, a little bit below or above that. It's really not that bad. It's a little bit windy. It might cause damage, but if it's causing damage, it's to something that was already pretty loose or, you know, starting to deteriorate anyway. We really don't start seeing the heavy damage until about Cat 3, 4, and 5, even really 3. You know, I don't really evacuate personally until it gets maybe a 4. I'll consider it a 5. Yeah, I might. I've actually never evacuated to this day, but if it does hit a 5 and it looks like it's going to hit us, I might evacuate. Now, of course, another thing to look out for Floridians, and this is just sort of a local joke here, but is to start freaking out whenever the Waffle House or Walmart closes. That's when the Floridians go, oh man, should we have gotten out of here? So if that ever happens, maybe you need to evacuate. Another thing to do is make sure you're keeping your eyes on the news, on the weather, to make sure that if you are visiting primarily, if you live here, you're probably going to know your evacuation zone. But if you do not live here, then make sure that you're checking that out. Figure out where your condo is, your vacation home, or, you know, the friend's house that you're staying at, or whatever it is, so that you know when you need to evacuate. There are certain zones. The entire state of Florida is not in an evacuation zone. So if you're wondering, am I in an evacuation zone? I live here right now. You might be. So maybe check that out. Generally, the weather channel, or you'll get alerts on your phone or alerts on your TV, your smart TV, what have you, that will tell you whenever it's time to evacuate. So if you are in one of those zones, they will generally notify you, but just be cognizant of it, just in case something happens and they get the word out late. At least you know where you stand. Maybe 1 or 2 days before the hurricane actually makes landfall, this is a pretty good time to start putting up your hurricane shutters. If you have just recently bought a house in the area, or you're living in a place, you're renting a place and they have hurricane shutters, it's always a good idea that you take those out and attempt to put them on whenever you move into the home, so at least you know where they all go, because they are fitted for each window. They look like they're just plywood boards that any of them would go anywhere, but they're actually fitted to each window. So you want to make sure that you know how to do that. The first time you'll do this, it might take 3 or 4 hours depending on the size of your home. So it's never fun to be doing this when you're already a little bit panicked that there's a hurricane coming through. You're worried about your family, you're worried about getting groceries, you're worried about getting the car filled up, you're worried about all this stuff, and now the plywood boards are not coming in. They also have fabric shields you can get, which are amazing. They're really good for insurance as well. And they're just, you know, big old fabric shields that'll go on there, screw the wing nuts on, and they will supposedly protect your windows pretty good. I've never heard any complaints about them, so I imagine they work pretty good, but it literally just feels like basically like a trampoline type material. It's not really a trampoline material, but it's like sort of that thing, and it just stretches over the window. When I first saw them, I was like, no way that's protecting the window. But I've got a lot of past clients that are using it and they have no problems. So clearly it works, and they're way faster than the plywood boards. The plywood boards will generally be taken out, and very similar, the holes will be drilled for you. You'll throw some wing nuts on there and go ahead and do that. Now, a lot of people, you'll notice if you live here in Florida, they're not going to put those up until a hurricane gets pretty bad. There are some some people, of course, that as soon as a tropical storm warning is out there, they're out there throwing up their boards. It's just more work than it's worth to me and to a lot of us, I think, especially because these hurricanes can do anything. Literally, Michael last year, no, 2018, 19, I can't remember which year it was exactly, looked like it was headed straight for us. We were actually getting a little worried because at the time I stayed and it turned into, I think it was a Cat 4 or Cat 5 right at the last second, and then it just turned and it actually hit our neighbors just to the east of us, unfortunately, over there in Panama City. They got hit pretty bad. That was kind of an eye-opener for me. I've lived here 16 years, give or take, and that was the first time I'd seen anything. I missed or seen anything with actual damage, right? So a lot of the trees were knocked down. In fact, even to this day, a couple of years later, when you drive through there, a lot of the trees that are on the highway are just completely down. These huge trees have been there hundreds of years, just gone, knocked over. A bunch of damage to the base over there, a bunch of damage to the city. So a little bit of an eye-opener. I think maybe evacuating might be, you know, something I might do in the future. The last major hurricane that actually hit this area, outside of Panama City, of course, was Ivan, which I think was in 2005. I think it was pretty late in the hurricane season that year, and it did a ton of damage. From what I've seen pictures, it was a lot. So hurricanes can be a lot of damage, a lot of devastation. As long as you're evacuated out of those areas, you should be good, but that's not always the case. If you are worried about it, just go ahead and evacuate. It's really not that big of a deal. Just get out of town, get out of Dodge. Better safe than sorry, sort of thing. All right, the day that the hurricane is coming in, you should have everything prepared. If you didn't have a chance to get water, maybe you're a little bit worried that you didn't get enough, a good strategy is to fill up your bathtubs with water, maybe even your sinks. Give them a good scrub down. Make sure you clean them pretty good before you do that. Don't leave any of the residue behind for the cleaning products, because this will be drinking water if you absolutely need it. What generally happens is not that your entire house gets taken away or anything like that, although that is possible depending on where you're at, how close to the coast you are. The hurricane does get stunted pretty good as soon as it hits landfall. That's when it starts dissipating immediately. But of course, even if you're 20 miles inland, you can definitely get some damage, especially if it's a really big hurricane like that. So here it comes. It's about to make landfall. You're hunkered down in your house. You're playing some board games with the kiddos or whatever you're doing. You've got your tubs full of water. You've got your hurricane preparedness kit ready to go out the door if you need to. Cars gassed up. Everything's good to go. Now, what does a hurricane actually seem like when you're inside? Now, a lot of it is just gonna feel like a windstorm, very similar to what we were kind of showing before. But if it's big enough, this wind will be going almost straight sideways. I'm not kidding. That, whole 45, 55, 85 mile an hour winds, they're taking the water right with it. So don't go outside. Don't be that guy. I had a friend way back when that decided he was gonna go outside in the middle of a hurricane to see if he could withstand the weather. And I watched him get blown like 30 feet down the street. He was fine, but the fact of the matter is, don't fight Mother Nature. I promise you, she's stronger. So go ahead and stay hunkered down. Make sure that as the hurricane's coming through, you're kind of checking the house a little bit. Make sure that a tree doesn't come through any of the windows, or, some shingles rip off. You need to throw a bucket underneath it or something like that. Wind damage does happen, particularly to roofs. These shingles are prone to fly off, so you could get a leak right in the middle of a hurricane. If you do, as long as it's not too bad, don't freak out. Just be aware of the rest of the house to make sure that nothing else is flying off and that hopefully your roof is still intact. Now, if it gets to the point where your roof does start coming off, maybe you're getting a really bad area or something like that, try to stay in the house until winds are a little bit calmer. Even if there's water coming in, I know it's not going to be fun. It's going to be a very scary moment, but the winds will die down eventually and you can run to a neighbor's house that still has a roof on. Again, this is extremely rare. If you evacuated when you were supposed to, you shouldn't have any of this major damage unless there was something wrong with the roof, or the roof was old or something like that. Or something comes through a window, or a tree crashes into your property. This stuff does happen, guys, so be aware of that. Be aware of where your trees are in the yard, where the wind's coming from. So if you've got a big old oak tree that's been sitting there for 200 years, it's probably not going anywhere, but if the wind is going to where it would go straight into the master bedroom, maybe you sleep on the couch that day. Just my suggestion. Now, the best thing to do at this point, as the winds are coming in and it's getting a little, maybe you're getting a little anxious, you're kind of freaking out a little bit, go have a board game, go play with the kids, go have a drink if that's what you need to do, something to calm those nerves, and just wait. Most likely the power is going to go out. It's very common that the powers go out during hurricanes. This is why a lot of people have generators, but don't be that person that goes out and buys a generator 3 days before a hurricane. They don't need it and they take it right back. I'm telling you, Sam's Club, Walmart, those are the two big ones that people get these generators from, and Lowe's. Lowe's last year, they wouldn't take them back. So if you're gonna spend the money on a generator, just spend the money on the generator, hook it up, get it prepared. This way it's always there whenever you have a hurricane. Test it once, I think it's once a year, once every 6 months, something like that. But But that's if you have a generator. If not, just expect that your power is going to go out. You could have some coolers ready with a bunch of those ice packs in them, or have those already in your freezer so that when the power does go out, you can take stuff out of the freezer and the fridge. Now, the freezer and the fridge stuff is going to last quite a while. I don't know if it's a couple of days, I don't know if it's 12 hours, what have you, but it's a pretty good amount of time. So just because the power goes out doesn't mean you need to immediately start taking everything, throwing them in coolers. Give it some time. It could be a temporary power outage. That is very common during hurricanes as well. Now, the reason why you need so much water and food is not actually because you might be stranded out here in the wilderness or anything like that. It's because the power is out and you can't really cook anything. Maybe the water goes out. That's extremely rare, but it could happen. And that's the main reason. And of course, if you need to, if maybe the hurricane looks like it's turning towards you, you've got that vehicle gassed up, ready to go, you could probably get out of Dodge just in time. Just make sure you're timing that properly. There would be nothing worse than trying to escape a hurricane and then it actually catching up to you while you're in your SUV flying down the highway at 60 miles an hour. Not a good idea. So if you're gonna leave at the appropriate time. If they tell you, hey, this is the cutoff, you can't leave again, don't leave 1 minute after that. You are putting your life in danger, especially if there's traffic or something. Like, just don't do it. If the roads are washed out, don't do it. It's just not smart, please. Stay in your house. It's gonna be a little bit safer there, even if you're in one of the evacuation zones. I think you're gonna be a little bit more safe there than you will on the road. Of course, listen to the authorities. That's what they're there for. Now, if the hurricane is a light one, I do not suggest going out and checking it out, but I will say that I've done that in the past. When I was a young, dumb 21-year-old, we decided to go out to one of the piers and watch the hurricane after it had passed, after the eye had already passed us and we were at kind of the wit's end of it. And we went out to the pier, which was closed, probably shouldn't have done. And if you guys have been here and you've seen how tall our piers are that are above the water, now try to imagine, hopefully we'll get some video to throw over this so that you can see it. Try to imagine how tall that thing is. And while we were out there, these waves were crashing over it. Now, it was not like huge where it was above it and coming down, but they were hitting the pier so hard that the waves were crashing into the pier. We were getting just absolutely soaked. And you know, as a young, dumb 21-year-old, it was a great time. Don't get me wrong. Cracked open a couple of brews out there and just enjoyed it. And most of the weather was gone, but not a smart move. Try to wait until everything is out of here before you go outside and start assessing damage and things like that. Which brings me to my next point. As soon as a hurricane is done, this is where you want to assess the damage. Check your neighbors, make sure everybody's okay, especially if you see some damage on a house. You see a tree inside somebody's kitchen, maybe go over there, definitely check them out, make sure they're okay. See if they need anything. They might need a room to stay in as their house is, you know, completely just covered in water, completely flooded out. That's very common. And depending on where you're at, you might need some help. For instance, the agent of ours that was in the middle of Sally, they had to evacuate. It was mostly due to the flood. It actually had very little to do with the winds, although the winds did play a part. They were able to escape right in the middle of it. But at the end of the day, as soon as it's done, this is when a lot of work is going to happen, especially if you're on the water, like, you know, the bay or the sound or even on the Gulf. Chances are there's going to be a lot of wreckage around you. There might be a boat in your backyard. I'm not making this up. There could be other people's docks in your yard. Whenever it happened to our agent, we actually had to go over there and there was a ton of wreckage. It took days of people working around the clock to pull this stuff out. There was an entire dock in our yard. There was a boat that had crashed up against it because the water was that high, literally exceeded the docks, exceeded the land, and this thing just cruised right in because it was, you know, sitting out there and floated with the water. So help your neighbors out, be friendly. You're probably not going to work anyway. If you do, then obviously you can't really help there. If you've got one of those jobs that's helping with infrastructure or, you know, helping getting the power back on or any of that stuff. But for the most part, most employers are going to be like, nope, we got to clean stuff up. We got to get everything ready. The roads are normally going to be washed out for the most part. You do get a lot of rain with some of these, and depending on how much rain you get, the roads could be washed out more or less. So this is why you actually have all the water and food. Most people think it's because, well, you know, you're going to be out of power, and I know I kind of mentioned that earlier, but most of it's because you're probably going to be stuck in your house for a couple of days as we just wait for all the rainwater to, or the ocean, if you will, depending on where you're at, because sometimes the ocean is now just part of the roads for a little bit. We're waiting for all of that to die down and go back into the Gulf, just dry up, just in general, the entire area. So you've got your food and water there if needed. The businesses will start opening up as quick as they can, and with any luck, there's not a whole lot of damage. You clean up what you've got, and then you move on with your life. Now, helping out your neighbors is a good idea, but you also need to check your own home. So do a quick perimeter search. Just make sure nothing got through one of the windows, especially if you didn't board them up or you don't have hurricane shutters. Not every house does. Not every condo does. So keep this in mind if you're down here vacationing and a storm is coming through. They might not have extra hurricane protection. Now, new buildings building codes and stuff for condos show that they should have hurricane rated windows and stuff like that, but not everybody's caught up to that. So just keep that in mind. If you own a home down here, if you've got a ladder, go up on the roof, see if there's any shingles missing. If there are, there's a bunch. You might want to call a roofing company, see if your insurance might cover that. They can generally tell by how the granular wear is on the shingles if it was actually hurricane or not. So it might be a good time to get the roof replaced, especially if it's a bit older. Those are generally the only ones you're going to have an issue with. I put on a brand new roof right before one of the hurricanes a couple of years ago in one of the rentals, and it was perfectly fine. Went up there, everything looked good. You want to check your siding if you've got, any sort of siding. Check your windows, and of course, check for any flood intrusion. Speaking of that, I'm bouncing around a little bit. Flood intrusion just made me remember something. If you do live in a flood zone or you're in an area where you have seen the water get close to your house before and you want to protect yourself, in almost every area that I know of in Florida, there are opportunities for you to get sandbags. They're generally free, and as far as I know, they are completely free. They'll have the bags out there. They'll have a big pile of sand for you. I don't know who brings this stuff out. I don't know if it's government or what, but it's always really good to do. Grab some sandbags, throw them in front of your doors. Those are generally what you're going to have to protect because the doors are not seal proof, at least in most homes are not. And then of course, if there's any other water that might get near a window, if you've got those real low windows, which some of the houses do have, and you're worried about a little bit of leakage there, I would probably throw a couple of sandbags in front of there. You don't need to stack it up 4 feet high. We're not going to war here. You don't need it as a bunker to fight off zombies. You need it just enough to keep the water out. So keep that in mind. You can even keep them inside until the hurricane hits because you're generally not going to need them during the hurricane. In most cases, sometimes you will. A lot of times it's actually after the hurricane. Again, not all the time, but in a lot of cases it's after the hurricane when, most of the winds have gone away, but the rain is just constantly because of all the clouds just dumping on you as you go. Some of these hurricanes you will have 2 to 3 inches of rain. Other times you will have 1.5 feet. So just keep that in mind. It's very, very important. So if you don't know where the water is going to be at a resting point during a hurricane or during high rain, then probably grabbing a couple of sandbags just to be safe is probably a good thing. You can always keep them in your garage, maybe, use them to work out with or something like that, or just keep them until the next storm. Now, after the fact, if you do have damage, whether it's to your car, to your house, call your insurance company, let them know. They're generally going to take care of it fairly quickly, but not all the time. Some insurance companies are a little bit slower than others. This is where people go into good and bad insurance companies because some are going to pay out claims much faster. Be very weary of people offering to put tarps on the home and saying that it's insurance refundable. I've heard lots of scams that come, that people will do that. They'll come from neighboring cities. They'll come down with just a ton of tarps and tie-offs, 550 cord. I don't know what it is exactly, and they'll come over and they'll say, hey, I notice your roof is not good. Half of it's ripped off, or we'll throw a tarp up there for $5,000. And a lot of times they'll tell you that it's insurance refundable, and I don't think it is. It might be for certain insurances to prevent extra damage from happening. Just make that call as you go, and if you do need something like that, call around, because some of these people, they know that you're in a distress situation and they're going to try to take advantage of that, try to charge you $10,000, $15,000 for putting a tarp on a roof, and it only takes them a couple hours. So try to just be aware of that there are people out there that are going to prey on somebody in a bad situation. Another thing I forgot to mention is having all of your important documents in a plastic bag and have that ready to go. Should also have it in a firebox or something like that, I think is what people say. I don't, but you probably should. Maybe throw it in a plastic bag so it doesn't get rained on. There's nothing worse than having to replace your marriage certificate and passports and IDs and your house documents, and it's just a nightmare. It's better. Throw them in a gallon plastic bag. I actually keep mine in one already. Every time I get a new document that I know I need to keep, I just throw it in that same one. So this way I know exactly where it's at. I can pick up and grab it if I needed to leave. You do not want that stuff getting destroyed. And other than that, a hurricane 99% of the time is going to be perfectly enjoyable. Well, not enjoyable. It's going to be a nuisance. It's going to be a little bit of anxiety might build up, but honestly, 99% of the time, it's just a little bit of wind. You hear it howling outside. In fact, the last couple of storms that came through, I was completely asleep for. I woke up in the morning, checked the weather, and was like, oh, it must not have hit us, because I look outside and it looked like this, like as if something had hit us, but whatever. And I would look and it would be like, oh, it was gone by 3 in the morning. Like, oh, awesome. That's how a lot of them are going to be. Hurricane parties can be a very fun time as well, as long as the hurricane's not too rough. You're playing Cards Against Humanity, you're having some drinks, you and your friends are having a good time. Just keep them in line. This is where I'm going at this is what I was getting at earlier when I was mentioning, like, hey, don't go outside in the hurricane. This is the kind of stuff that you need to rally your friends back in. Hey, you're not invincible. You're just on a White Claw high or whatever you're drinking, right? So try to keep them safe. Make sure that everything is good. And really, really, it's part of living down here. If that scares you from moving here to Florida and that's the main thing, just evacuate every time there's a storm. It's not gonna be that big of a deal. You shouldn't let hurricanes stop you from moving to Florida. Well, if this video helped you out even a little bit, please hit that like button. It helps us get the word out to other people. We would really appreciate it, and that's really all we got this time. And go ahead and comment down below if you've ever been through a hurricane or what your worries are about being in a hurricane. We really enjoy the back and forth talking to you guys. If you guys go to any of our other videos, you'll see that we try to comment on everything. We absolutely love talking to you guys, so go ahead and put that stuff below. Let's have a conversation. Well, until next week, see ya.